often do you question your dietary standards? Do you trust the government to tell you what is healthy for you to eat? The guidelines put in place for our dietary standards set the direction of our federal nutrition program, as well as the advice given to the American people by their health professionals. If you've ever been told by a doctor to eat certain types of foods, that advice is coming from the government. The meals you ate in grade school were set with the government's standards in mind. If you've ever learned about my pyramid or my plate, then you've learned about the dietary standards our government believes is good for us all. Americans' nutrition plays an incredibly important role in our health, and the government implemented guidelines are a crucial step in striking a healthy diet for the American public. In this speech, I will talk about how it came about that the government would dictate our dietary standards, the health conditions that stemmed from the choices our government made about those standards, and what changes these standards will see in the next 5 years. Since the early 1900s, rates of deaths caused by heart disease has risen from 20,000 to 800,000 deaths in the 60s and 70s. The United States government had a real health crisis on its hands, and all evidence pointed to the way Americans eat as their killer. Can you guess what the response was? According to the McDougall's newsletter, the initial response by the U.S. Senate was strong, with a chance of revolutionizing the way Americans eat. The Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs, led by Democratic Senator of South Dakota, George McGovern, introduced the 1977 Dietary Goals for the United States, which recommended that Americans should eat less meat, milk, butter, cheese, salt, and simple sugars, and more fruits, vegetables, unsaturated fats, and cereal products, especially whole grains. This report, which was nicknamed the McGovern Report, caused a large uproar in the food industry, especially in the meat, milk, and egg industries. These various food industries presented their own version of the guidelines in the McGovern's report that focused less on reducing meat and dairy products and spared no expense or resource to lobby the government, push their own nutrition curriculum on students, put out massive advertisement campaigns, and fund nutrition research that would favor their side. Ultimately, the government sided with these big agribusinesses, and in the 1980s, the USDA partnered with the Health and Human Service Department to issue the first edition of their dietary guidelines for Americans, which many will recognize as the USDA food pyramid. So did heart rates fall with these new guidelines in place? Nope. Americans' health got worse, with diabetes and obesity rates doubling since the 1980s. The government's guidelines called for Americans to prioritize their consumption of meat, fish, and milk products in direct opposition with the recommendations of the McGovern Report. In place of reducing these products, the government opted for America a low-fat diet that the food industry pumped high in sugars and additives. This wasn't the intention of the government, but the food industry found the low-fat diet strategy to be a high-profit making machine. Low-fat meals to lower cholesterol were all the rage in the 80s, and in the 90s, low-fat became no-fat, with all sorts of processed foods for Americans to snack on. The McGovern Report had warned that heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and hypertension are the diseases that kill us. They are epidemic in our population, and we cannot afford to temporize. We have an obligation to inform the public of the current state of knowledge and assist the public in making the correct food choices. To do less is to avoid our responsibility. Well, the government did do less. And it has shown in the continued increase in chronic diseases that medical treatment could never replace a healthy and balanced diet. These are at least the faux pas of the past, and we can look forward to pushing stronger dietary standards in the future, starting with 2020 to 2025. The 2020 to 2025 Dietary Standards for Americans was released in December 28, 2020, and has a focus on cutting saturated fats, added sugar, sodium, and alcohol intake. It also aims to increase consumption of fruits, vegetables, grains, as well as an emphasis on customizing one's individual food intake to their own cultural and health needs. One significant change in the 2020 to 2025 dietary standards from the last 40 years of guidelines is the specific focus on infants and toddlers, as well as prenatal recommendations for new and expecting mothers. One incredibly significant recommendation is that babies should be fed human milk for the first 6 months of their lives. I wonder how the milk and formula industries think of that. The 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines also came with a call to action in the Make Every Bite Count with the dietary standards to get Americans back on track with their diet. No longer can the government avoid its responsibility to the American people's health. Americans' nutrition plays a big role in our health, and the government implemented guidelines are a big step in striking a healthy diet for the American public. The government has been giving the American public nutrition guidelines that has made the food industry extremely profitable at the expense of the American public's health. But it's time to correct the mistakes of the past. Will you be paying attention to your own dietary standards and how they measure up to the standards the government wishes to set for us?